Welcome everyone to this Big Sofa event of this month's II Live, and I'm delighted today to have as my guest Iain McGilchrist to talk about one of the key themes of his new book, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World.
Thanks very much, Alexis. Glad to be here.
One of the key themes of your new book that I'd like to talk to you about today is that reality isn't made of things. But my common sense seems to tell me otherwise, right? The world looks to me to be made very much of things, to be made of tables and chairs and my laptop that I'm looking at now and people and trees. And then on the other hand, we have physics that tells us or seems to tell us that the world at its most fundamental level is made out of particles, out of forces and fields. So what's wrong with those two pictures of reality?
There's nothing wrong with the idea of things. I'm very content that people should go on thinking there are things and treating them as such. But ultimately, I believe that all is in process, that as Heraclitus said, everything flows. And I'm a follower of A.N. Whitehead, who of course was a process philosopher. And I also hold the slightly, perhaps at the outset, rather paradoxical sounding view that relationships are prior to the relata. What primarily exists is relationships, and things are what emerge from this network. It's perfectly okay to see them as things and to focus on them and all that, but it's just not the best way of thinking about composing a view of the cosmos, that it's made up of things. Rather, as a body is not actually made up of organs that are developed and then connected to one another, the whole organism comes into being by the differentiation into the organs that can later, after the fact, be identified as parts.
Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to this position of thinking of the world as being primarily made out of relations, not things?
Well, it's something that I suppose has come to me rather gradually over a long time. I suppose I've been thinking about this sort of thing for 50 years or more. And right at the beginning of those 50 years, I thought that the whole was not the same as the sum of the parts, and that you couldn't necessarily put something together in the way that you can take it apart. So that's always been part of my philosophical outlook on the world. The idea that things are relationships follows partly from that, in that not just an organism as we would normally think of it, but a piece of music is not better understood by taking it apart note by note, but is in fact a seamless web of relations. And it's that seamless web of relations that is real.
So as you mentioned before, there's something quite radical about your position in that you see relations as fundamental, as kind of prior to the things that are related. And you say somewhere that the things that are related only become what they are in and through the relationships they belong to.
Precisely.
It's the context that makes them what they are.
Exactly.
Now, you admit that this position can seem at least paradoxical, right? It poses the question of how we really can make sense of relations without already having in view the very things that are supposed to be related. So how do you avoid this apparent paradox?
Well, I don't think it's difficult. As you say, and this has been, again, a lifelong concern, certainly since my 20s when I was first at All Souls, and looking at the way we approach works of art, poems, so forth, it seemed to me that one of the problems was the idea that we took things out of context. As soon as you start sitting in the seminar room, you begin the process of disembodying, abstracting, removing from context, making the unique general, and making the implicit explicit. All of these working in the exact opposite direction to the one in which the work itself is trying to lead you. And I think that that's not something peculiar about art. It's something about life, and that art and poetry and so on are just examples of organic beings, as Aristotle indeed thought they were, not examples of mechanisms or building blocks.
And you do say that sort of seeing the world as made of things is part of this kind of reductionist picture that much of science operates under, and the idea that in order to understand the nature of something, we need to understand its parts and the mechanics of those parts. And you accept that this approach has made science extremely successful at allowing us to manipulate the world around us, to predict it, to create new technology.
Yes.
Now, realists often see this argument as basically showing that science gets to the truth of what the world is like. And the argument is, look, it works. It allows us to do all these things that no other picture of reality allows us to do. So why is the ability to manipulate the world not proof in your view that science actually understands the world? What exactly is science missing here?
Ask the sorcerer's apprentice, who knew exactly how to press the button, but didn't really understand what he was doing. I think there's something similar here. There are 2 points, really. I mean, the first one I ought to make is that naive idealist or naive realist, I insist that, as it were, we take part in reality, but we don't simply ground it or originate it. So whatever reality we encounter has something of us about it, but it also has something that is not us about it. And it's in that encounter that we find reality in our experience. So that's the first thing, I suppose. The other is that when you have a very complex system, and sometimes I have a slide that illustrates a massively complex system in which there are arrows leading from just about everything to everything else, there are little areas, if you focus in on them, where there's a chain of causation and it's not that complicated and you can intervene in it and you would no doubt have a predictable result by doing so. But if you were asked a different question, not how to manipulate the world, but how to understand it, you couldn't understand it by just putting together linear sequences, because that wouldn't answer to the complexity of what you're dealing with. And as you probably know, and anyone who's read either of those books would know, I believe the raison d'etre of the left hemisphere is to manipulate the world. It's to be a very good aid to the business of grabbing and getting precisely what you want at the time. But just because it does that, it's not very good at understanding. And that is really the forte of the right hemisphere. And this is why the 2 hemispheres are asymmetrical and only partially connected at all. Only 2% of fibers cross the corpus callosum, the band of fibers at the base of the brain. And a lot of that traffic is inhibitory. It's saying, I'm dealing with this. You keep out of it. So, it's a complex thing, what's going on in our brains and our minds. And it's not simply good enough to say, well, because I can intervene in a causal chain and create some and have a certain kind of outcome. It is something rather made on the model of the bike in the garage that's put together from bits.
What's the proof? What's the criterion by which we can be sure that we understand something rather than just able to kind of causally interfere with it?
If you understand better the structure of reality, you will be less often caught out by experience. So, in other words, it's a test on experience, effectively. And the lovely thing that I can demonstrate and do at some length in this new book, about 400 pages length of the book, is to look at what happens when the right hemisphere is not functioning. And the answer is the left hemisphere simply doesn't understand the world. I mean, it really is as simple as that. It's the almost all delusional states, hallucinations, misjudgments. It simply can't read people, for a start. It doesn't understand emotional and social communication, in that it's somewhat autistic, if you like to look at it that way. Nonetheless, the structure of reality is not changed, but when the right hemisphere is damaged, it is changed. I think it's fairly conclusive.
Let me ask you something on this, because a lot of your work originates in sort of neuroscience research, and sometimes you bring examples from theoretical physics to support your claims, but here you've been talking a lot about this, what we learn by how we understand the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere and how they contribute very different things to our cognitive relationship to the world.
Exactly.
But is there a tension there within your own philosophy, as it were? Because on the one hand, you seem to be arguing for the limits of scientific understanding, the way that science is reductionist and it only offers us a very narrow understanding of reality, the world, ourselves. But on the other hand, it seems like you're using the findings of scientific research to ground your own picture of what science is sort of missing out. So
absolutely,
how do you negotiate that tension?
extraordinarily easily. I'm a great admirer of science. I've studied science all my life. It was my first passion as a child. My father and my grandfather were scientists, and that was what I was introduced to. I argue rationally all the way through my writing, and people say you make it very clear and you use all these things like science and reason. How come? Well, the answer is because I think they're very valuable. I just don't think that reason can account for everything any more than I think science can. There's nothing irrational about listening to Mozart's G minor quintet. It's just supra-rational, trans-rational, not encompassable by rationality.
Let me ask you about something you mentioned earlier when it came to understanding life non-reductively.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.